Okay, well, welcome to viewers in the future to this Innovators and Insights session on Kurt Hahn and the 7 Laws of Salem and many other topics adjacent and connected to that. I'm Chris Lott. I'm with the Office of Digital Learning at University of Washington, Tacoma. And today that we are having a conversation with Todd Conaway from University of Washington, Bothell. And I will go ahead and hand it over to you, Todd, if you want to provide any context or anything around Kurt Hahn and how you want to launch this conversation off with our intrepid pioneer, Greg, here.
Excellent. Well, I'll add a little context just briefly about myself, but I want to start with just a story of how I got to Kurt Hahn, and then we'll have. I got a cart and pony show that just has a couple things in it, and then we can discuss more. But my job's I'm an instructional designer. I've been doing that for 17 years. So I watch faculty teach, and I talk to them about their world of teaching. And it's so amazing to me because they all have different stories, different backgrounds, different experiences that inform how they teach. And I really love the idea of guiding people or being with people headed towards some common goal. I think that's just an amazing moment in life when you are part of that thing, whether it's a team, a work team, or a sports team, or a family, or whatever it is. I'm very interested in people moving forward in groups. So I get to hear a lot of those stories, and that's kind of my job, is helping them with my stories that I share and whatever I know to maybe assist them on their journey. So that's my job. I'm going to show you 2 pictures, a chart, and then I'm going to show you a couple things I have here on my desk, and then we'll get going. Fair enough?
Good.
Always bring handouts, or always bring things to show people. All right, so this is me at about either 15 or 14, I'm not sure, but it was 1978. I had, months before this photo was taken, I had told my mom and dad that I was running away to go live in the woods. I was living in Newport Beach, that's where I was raised. And I was all done with that culture and that scene, and I was going to be like Jeremiah Johnson and live out in the wilderness on the land. And my best friend at the time there on the left was going to go with me. Mom and dad started crying when I told them that, and my mom and dad were divorced, but about 8 months or a year later, my dad and I moved to a place called Prescott, Arizona. So we went from the little town in 78 we moved in 79, and it was still a small little village by the sea, Newport Beach was, to an even way smaller village in the woods of Prescott, Arizona. About 20 years later, I was able to do this with my students, and I did that a lot. I took them all over the Western United States. I was an English teacher, but I deeply integrated things into my classroom that might speak to Kurt Hahn or experiential education. And that's kind of where I want to go next. And I have a couple things to kind of show you here. So I was really unhappy, as you can imagine, in high school and everything in Newport Beach. And I went to Prescott, and I thought that might be better. And it was sort of, but I still hated school. I went to community college. It was sort of more of the same. And weirdly, somewhere in my time at community college, we discovered that in the same little town we were was a place called Prescott College. So Prescott College, in the mid-60s, the Ford Foundation gathered a bunch of educators to build the university of the future. It was going to be like the Yale of the West or something along those lines. And they created this miraculous vision of a school. Approximately 10 years later, one of the trustees absconded with all their money, and it literally bankrupted the school. By the time I arrived in 79 to Prescott, they were getting things going again. And literally the second year I was in community college there in Prescott, they got their accreditation back. When I started there, there were 99 students. And it was one building, an old convent. It was not a religious school, but they had found a convent to use as a school. And they espoused what we call experiential educational practices, or experiential education. That was their thing. And I didn't know really any of the history beyond people were telling me, like, well, the first thing they do is take you out for an orientation, 3 weeks in the wilderness, walking around with a group of people, and they kind of orient you to this new way of going to school. And that they use they said the Southwest is their classroom. So they did a lot of field trips, right? Or at least that's what I was thinking. And I thought that would be great, right? I mean, to me, as somebody who just really wasn't thriving in the traditional school setting, that sounded pretty cool to me. So I started there, went on this 3 weeks with these people, and part of that experience was a 2-night, 3-day solo experience where you're out there in the middle of nowhere trying to think of things all to keep yourself busy. And all of these things were done under the context of what experiential learning and Kurt Hahn had to share with the world of education. At Prescott College, for example, one of the things I did, I think it was literally the second year I was there, right at the very beginning, a friend of mine and a classmate of mine and I thought we should go to the redwood forest and document our experience wandering around the redwoods. And so we did. And we came back with this big old journal, right? That's handwritten, and the pages have pictures. And this was back in the time where when you took a picture, you didn't know what it looked like until about a week later when you got it back from the drugstore, right? But it's this big book of all these animals, whales, trees, flowers, and all kinds of stuff. And as you can imagine, on a trip like that, when you're 21 years old, you learn a lot of things and you see a lot of things, and you're challenged with a lot of things that maybe aren't directly related to the flora and fauna of the redwood forest. I also got on a train in Flagstaff, Arizona, and went to Winfield, Kansas, where there is a Southwestern University. And there for about 3 weeks, I was a TA in a class called Alternative Methods in Higher Education. How weird is that, right? I was like 21 or 22, and there I am at this university. And I mean, I looked like, this was pre-grunge, but I looked like I was going to be in the grunge crowd. Definitely hardcore hippie, long hair, just pretty ratty looking guy. And there I was in Kansas, espousing all these kind of weird things about school. And at that school, we did a lot of work in the community. So what I learned as all that was happening was that John Dewey, Kurt Hahn played integral roles in the formation of what they were going to call back in the 60s, this new amazing university. And so my story is sort of deeply rooted in that. And in fact, not unlike the photo I just shared with you, I ended up taking students. This was in the year 2000. So this was 17 years after I had gone to the Redwoods. I took people to Yosemite and the Redwoods and the Grand Canyon. And this is the kind of thing they created, right? It was the same sort of book, but a little more modern, right? I took students out climbing, and they wrote about their experience. And so a lot of what I did in my portfolios at Prescott College kind of came to life later on as a K-12 teacher for me. And so that's kind of how I got to Kurt Hahn. I think that's sort of the journey I took, or I was on, arriving at his ideas. And Greg, if you've been in the Pacific Northwest very long, you're probably familiar with Evergreen State College. One of the things I did back in probably 85 or so as a student at Prescott College, I went to a few different Association for Experiential Education conferences. And Willie Unsold was one of Evergreen's outdoor educators, and he passed away along with, I think, like 5 or 7 students up on Rainier. This was back in, I think, 83 or 85. I don't really remember exactly when it was, but the conference I was at, his wife was given the Kurt Hahn Award because it was supposed to be given to him, and he had passed away. But anyway, that's another story. I'm going to pause here before I look at a little chart with kind of comparing Kurt Hahn's 7 laws and experiential education as it is more commonly known today. Any questions? Stephen, welcome. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in welcome to Steve as well. And just quickly, I'm curious, either Steve or Greg or both, did you have any experience, like did the name Kurt Hahn register with you? Had you heard of him or Expeditionary Learning, probably Experiential Learning most people have heard of? Were you familiar with this complex of stuff?
Yes, definitely. I previously had been a member of the Association for Experiential Education. So as soon as I saw the name, it clicked in my brain who we were going to be talking about or what we were going to be talking about. I did a major shift in my career. I switched from outdoor education, outdoor recreation, and physical education to geographic information systems in 2008 at UW-Tacoma. And I kind of got away from the experiential education. And when this popped up, I immediately registered. So,
awesome. Well,
thanks to both of you for putting this on. This is great.
Well, yeah, then I really hope to, continue to hear from you through the session, how this connects with you. Just for Ben and Steve, feel free to throw up your hand at any time, and I'll cede the floor. We really want to hear from you, especially from both of you. But I just want to set the context for people who watch this video later that if you haven't learned about Kurt Hahn, he was an educator who was born in the mid 1880s, I think died in, I don't know, it's on 1950s. He was a headmaster. He was founder of a couple of schools that ultimately led to this idea of expeditionary learning and experiential learning, outward bound. Some context for when you look at his work, though, that I think is important is he was situated right in the middle of World War I and World War II. He was dealing with a lot of chaos from those situations. It was a school system that was in great disrepair, along with being heavily focused on examinations. Everything was about exams. So in addition to all the personal turmoil, and then between and after the wars, there was incredible spikes in crime amongst adolescents, and he was trying to figure out what school could do for them. So he writes from a perspective that is obviously historical, and of course comes from a background that is, he has a lot of theological reasoning behind what he does. He was a Christian. He very much is addressing boys and men most of the time. It's just that's kind of an era, artifacts of the era. But when you set those aside and look at the philosophy of what he came up with and how it's worked itself out in expeditionary learning, experiential learning, place-based learning, service learning, the service being an important component in the experience, it's still highly relevant. But I think a lot of it has been elided. Like everybody I asked in the last few weeks about Kurt Hahn, nobody had heard of him before. And many of them hadn't even heard of experiential learning, really. They'd heard of place-based learning, but it just is something that isn't necessarily coming up a lot. So I wanted to provide that context. If you browse the 7 laws or the 10 ideas behind expeditionary learning, to kind of understand why we want to go in and think about them some more, right? And think about and how they work out in hybrid and online education from the Office of Digital Learning perspective, but not just that, but even on our campuses where, as Greg said, he moved from a field that was directly in experiential learning to one that isn't necessarily traditionally connected to that. So how do these principles carry through to that? So thanks for that little digression to history. And Todd, I'll hand it back to you.
No, that's thank you very much. Perfect. So so we're gonna look at the 7 laws, and I kind of grabbed some of the thoughts about experiential education, bullet points from the Association for Experiential Education site. Chris, thank you for doing that. I was going to give that same context, but you're great. I mean,
Okay, sorry about that.
There are literally books written on the guy, right? I mean, there are books about his work. He's that notable, and he was writing at a time, right, in the 1900 to 1940s, where, I mean, people like John Dewey were definitely writing and thinking about school, how to do it well, and some of the implications school has in our society. So it was a really rich time. You know, I'm pretty groovy, so people like A.S. Neal, Summerhill came out around 1920, I think. So all the kind of Lucy Wilde sort of innovative things are back from that era, especially fascinate me. So I'm gonna let's just look at the 7 laws and then kind of how they might tie to experiential education. Then we can just go through some of the laws and wonder about the word law, which may not be the right word to use for these, but ideas can be expressed in this work, right? So
so you see the evidence that this really is meant to be a conversation, not a presentation. I didn't coordinate with Todd to say, hey, are you going to cover this topic or that? So let's just flow with it and see where we go.
That's right.
We're experiencing it.
I mean, I am definitely like, when I was able to take photos like this of my students, I was feeling pretty good, right? Like, I felt like I was doing good education at that moment, right? And I literally all over the Western US with mountain bikes, hiking, backpacking. And a lot of that you'll see comes from these things, right? So on the left there, obviously, is the 7 laws, and on the right, some experiential education. I bolded some of the text on the right side. You know, more modernly, Kolb and sort of the experiential learning cycle. You know, reflection is huge in there. I feel like that fits pretty well with stillness or silence, kind of that reflective thing. And you can go through here and kind of wonder how experiential learning in today's world is defined. And Chris is absolutely right. I mean, service learning at its core comes from the work that Kurt Hahn did, and also is deeply, you know, wrapped in experiential education. So community-based learning, you know, wilderness therapy is a kind of a derivative of outward bound movements. So there's just a rich history of the notion of experiential education. Where I hear it today, where in my head, when people talk about active learning in classrooms and they talk about like clickers, in my head, I'm hearing, oh, you mean like experiential learning and sort of this stuff that comes from, you know, the 1920s, not poll everywhere or clickers in the classroom. And yeah, so there's the 7 laws as they were written. I am going to put those in chat, so we don't necessarily have to have them sitting on the screen here. See how they look in the chat. Very good. And then I'll put the experiential learning underneath that. And if you just kind of open up your uh-oh, boy. Is there a amount of text that you can put? I don't think I ever realized that. So I have some notes about some of these things and sort of how they've impacted me or the way I see them utilized. And unless somebody else wants to start with the first one here, self-discovery, spiritual awareness. I have some ideas around that where I've seen it recently active in classes. Anybody want to share any thoughts on all this? Chris,
why don't you go ahead and share one and a little bit about it, and then I'd love to throw open the floor about the thoughts on that, and also maybe choosing another one to think about. Because I will say that when we created this session and I shared the description to be shared with the UW Tri-Campus group, there was objections to it because they felt that the laws, some of them might be a little too provocative or controversial, or which I found fascinating given the point of what we were trying to do here. So maybe we can get to what here might strike people as, I mean, because obviously these are laws from quite a long time ago. They're not meant to be taken as literal facts to bring into the classroom in this form all the time. So let's maybe hear, Todd, from what's one of the ones most vital to you or interesting to you or most resonant with your practice, and then we can move from there.
I'm just going to pick the one at the top first, because my notes are kind of, the notes I have are sort of in the online like that.
Fair enough.
And I wasn't prepared for a trick question. So the opportunities for self-discovery and spiritual awareness, it was interesting during COVID, mindfulness really came rushing at us. It seemed like the notion of mindfulness in the classroom was something I read about, something I heard about from people. People were doing not meditation, but they were doing effectively meditation or moments of silence, guided imagery, stuff like that at the beginning of their Zoom sessions. And I think that, that while that may not be exactly what I would call like the pursuit of self-discovery in the long run, it certainly provides the stillness and the silence moment, but it also, I mean, I remember people saying things like, we're trying to come together as a group, we're trying to hear one another better. And I think those things to me are all part of like being more spiritual as you live your life, So I think as an example of something that's current or was happening during COVID that I saw in classes, that would be one example.
I definitely saw an uptick in people inquiring about how to bring, kind of insight meditation style things, ideas about how to have presence, because people were isolated, and being isolated and having self-awareness aren't necessarily things that work, that they don't follow one another necessarily, but they can, right? And so I think this is a really powerful one. And I do think that sometimes people might object to some of the terminology, like spiritual awareness can mean many different things to many different people, right? But I think there are a lot of practices you can bring in. The Teaching 101 class that we taught, I remember when those kinds of, some of these principles were integrated directly in with, self-care ideas that came out of that as well. And of course it ties to cognition, metacognition, and reflection. I mean, so all of these work together that way. Greg or Steve, do you have thoughts on this idea of self-discovery and spiritual awareness and how that works out, or any of the other laws? Well, I want to toss out something as an overall framing thought that came to my mind when I was thinking about this over the last few weeks, and that is that setting aside current global conflicts, I think we live in a time educationally that I don't feel is that different from what Kurt Hahn was dealing with, right? I mean, we have what I see as a breakdown of educational institutions in many ways, or a many forked path in which many of the paths led to warehousing style, factory style, emphasis on exams, GPAs, statistics of graduation, things that are all reflective of an end, not the actual educational process. And the larger an institution gets, I think the more it's subject to these kinds of forces. And so I don't think that it's that different. He was looking at the burgeoning of television. He made some really interesting, thoughts about television and technology, that these aren't bad things, but they can lead to behaviors that we have to counter and, teach. And here we are in a technological moment, and many technological moments of similar import. And COVID was, in a way, it laid waste to a lot of what we were doing educationally, especially when people weren't prepared for intentional online education to be a thing. And so we're dealing with many after effects of that I think are similar to what he was facing dynamically. Obviously, we're not looking at a spike in crime, but we are looking at delays in progress developmentally and educationally. We're looking at chaos within programs and sequencing. We're looking at skepticism about what the institutions can provide. So it's interesting to me to see the parallels where we're at and to kind of come back to these ideas. The one that triggered the controversy, as I understand it, in terms of advertising this session was the last one, freeing students from wealthy backgrounds from the paralyzing influence of wealth and privilege. And fair enough. If you take this literally, that might be something that we don't necessarily experience maybe as much, or maybe in this part of the university. But if you think about it, to me, isn't this at the heart of kind of equity initiatives and social justice and access to education? The idea that what that's talking about is socioeconomic status and means and how it plays into the educational process. And I think that's at the heart of what we should be thinking about, not something we should be worried about reflexively, being worried about the idea of wealth and privilege as a thing. I mean, I found it really astounding that that was the clause that was causing issues in terms of sharing this session. So that one really resonates with me. The other ones that resonate is just the overall idea of expeditionary learning. And I read something where Kurt Hahn was talking to a student who'd done this solo sailing expedition. And when he got done with the expedition, he was talking with a student. He said, well, did you enjoy that? Did you learn from it? And he said, absolutely, except while I was doing it. Which I thought was fascinating, right? So the experience, works itself out later in the metacognition and reflection, and working it into then continued engagement with the community and service. So I found that really powerful. And I don't, in Alaska, we had a lot of place-based education, which I think is an offshoot of this kind of experiential education idea, where you have students working in communities, often in far-flung communities, which is fascinating. I found rural science really fascinating, bringing indigenous ways of knowing into the process of traditional science classes, things like that I think are great. They take a lot of planning and time and effort to really pull off well, especially in an online environment, but I think there's so much potential there. And certainly I'm not speaking only to hybrid and online, but since that's the office I'm in, I want to make sure that that's in there. So those really resonated with me. So I'm curious, Greg or Steve, are you working in your current roles, expeditionary learning, experience-based learning, place-based learning, service learning? Are these things that?
So I think with what you offered here, a couple wonders came to my mind on this here. One is kind of like the framework that you shared earlier of where it really feels like we're in a moment, and especially since post-COVID, right? The experiences I have with my role as associate dean and supporting faculty and students, but also my experiences with students, is very much a kind of leaning into kind of the consumer model of education, right? That to me seems almost diametrically opposed to what you're discussing here, right? And you brought up that idea of like, we're kind of in similar times now of where a lot of what we're doing is kind of content. It's about not necessarily teaching to the test, but it's a means to an end, and it's not about the process, right? And so as I'm going through both these 7 laws, which can appreciate they're time and place contextually of what they were written. So looking at them for what they might mean now, right? Like reading between the lines of what this might mean today and not taking them at face value, right? I see a lot of challenges with our current structure of like, how do we implement these in what it feels like is very much a consumer model, right? And so with that said, I don't have answers. I know things that I try to do, but they're not as married to the foundational ideas that are presented here. But sharing just a couple things that I know of colleagues doing and of conversations in certain departments as well, of things that are trying to do that is really trying to identify like if we're still living in this consumer model and we can't flip the script or flip the switch immediately on it, right? It's like maybe there are like content courses and process courses, right? That was one conversation that one unit was having of like, this is about process learning. It's about the going through the process, not about, we're not giving them content. It's about the process, the experience, and what learns from that. And it's not saying we have these specific learning outcomes that are, you need to know this, and this. It's rather, you need to appreciate, go through this process, right? And whatever you get out of it is what you get out of it. And so that's a wonder that I have of as we navigate, or as we go forward, navigating that space of, if we can we bring in more of this process and value that and appreciate that in our curriculum, and not be solely focused on content. And examples of where I've seen this happen. I won't take credit for this for my class. I've tried it a little bit in some of my classes, but I'm not skilled in it. But we have some colleagues that when we talk about like the, not just mindfulness, as Todd, you mentioned there, like, hey, there was a lot of mindfulness in there, but like active meditative practices in classes, right? We have colleagues that are doing that, that are bringing in active meditative practices in curriculum that you wouldn't necessarily expect go hand in hand, right? One of our colleagues is math faculty that brings in active meditation and really presents the value of that, tries to share that and allow students to appreciate that, you know, the moments of stillness in silence can allow you to engage in that self-discovery that can actually now help you with the content stuff that we have to work on, right? And so there's bits and pieces of it. I don't see it widespread, and it's definitely not in my own personal pedagogy. It's not something that is as central as what I clearly hear, Todd. It's part of yours, right? And knowing a bit of Greg and what he does, I think it's much more of yours as well than it is my own personal.
I mean, there's a feeling sometimes, I mean, for one thing, obviously, right, there are many different pedagogical approaches, and they're not all universal. So there are going to be times where it's really challenging, time where it makes sense. It strikes me thinking about process and experience that we're right now in the middle of a huge technological question, challenge, context around AI, right? And so many of the objections to AI are not about the technology, but they're about robbing students of the experiential process parts of particular kinds of courses. And that totally makes sense, right? On the other hand, we have faculty who are teaching programming, for instance, who are really using AI because they know that those students are going to need to do that when they come out. And yet some of those faculty are the ones that are also needing to think about how do you collaborate. One of the things about stillness and silence to me is that is an effort. To my mind, it's something that aids in building the collaborative skills, leaves space for conversation, space for collaboration, space for ideas, space for reflection. Like that to me is universal. 5 minutes of meditation at the end of every class would be incredibly beneficial, I feel like, just generally. So yeah, it's fascinating to me to see, but at the same time, you're right. I mean, we're in institutions that value credentials, students value credentials more and more. Size is a problem with doing some of this. I mean, my ideal world of school, you'd have 2 students to every 1 mentor teacher for every subject. And, it would be right. Wouldn't that be fantastic? I don't live in that world, unfortunately. So we have to figure out how we can bring these things in. I'm curious, Greg, since both the transitions you've made and what you're doing, where are you finding, places to do this and where are the challenges still to be met?
I'm not doing a very good job, I don't feel. And I can blame it on the situation. I teach 3 different classes throughout the year, all geographic information systems and all lab classes, where the students are developing the skills set of GIS, whereas my colleague, Dr. Matt Kelly, teaches the critical GIS, the theory, and the project development. We're pretty siloed in what we teach, and by design, because I feel my forte is more on the skills side. The one that does resonate with me the most, and I just was speaking to my students last evening about this, are experiencing both success and defeat. I didn't use those terms directly, but I actually had a slide that I showed them. I think I saw it on Facebook or something. It had stacks of books and how much you learn from theory, and then how much you learn from practice, and then how much you learn from making mistakes. And it was just a huge stack of books. And I liken that to trying to reach them by talking about mountain biking or snowboarding, in that if you're not falling or making mistakes, then you're not really getting better at mountain biking or snowboarding. When you're falling, you're making mistakes and you're improving to prevent that. And then you start going faster or more difficult terrain. And that's the same with GIS. You're going to learn a lot more if you run into trouble with the labs. and you learn how to problem solve your way out of the labs. And another aspect to that I bring up to them is any reference calls that I've received, quite literally, none have asked me what were their grades like, or what was just anything along with grades or GPA. It was all, the number one question is how do they solve problems? How do they problem solve when they can't do something? And that's what I try to instill in my students, that I'm not going to give away the farm every time you ask me a question. I'm going to guide you, hopefully, to the right answer on your own. And then also I add in the last bit. I know I'm carrying on here. It's just popping in my head, but the community value of working with your peers to help solve a problem. And we do some of that sharing in the classroom. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great. That's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't say you're not doing it well. It's just we always have new vistas to explore and new things to try, right? I don't know how to do this in a lot of classes, both that I've taught and that I work with faculty on. I'm not sure, but it's trying to work that out. That's part of the kind of fun and the richness of it. You know, that idea of being able to experience failure, it's just so valuable. And if students are, and you see this working out all the time, like what's the reason that a lot of students don't want to do kind of group collaboration and presentation? I mean, they will, you know, most of the time underneath it's fear of failure, how they're going to look, how they're going to, you know, work with their peers, right? So I think continuing to find spaces for that to happen in a safe way, it's just incredibly valuable. I also wanted to draw attention to the service learning component in a couple of ways, and just share a quick experience I have. So my daughter is not like me at all. My daughter thinks before she talks. She looks before she leaps. She doesn't like discussion boards and forums and philosophy. Like none of that works for her very well. She's now an accountant. And when she was early on in her kind of schooling, she wasn't sure what she was going to do or if she was going to stick to it. In the course, the thing that got her to stick to it was she was in a class where they helped the unhoused and low-income folks do their taxes. And she just thought that was such an incredible experience. It was a service learning opportunity. They were, you know, learning how to do taxes. They were performing the service. People were great. And that hooked her into it. Like of all the things that she was doing, that was the thing that did it. And so I think there's going to be so many consequences around service learning that, you know, we approach it as educators. We have a structural approach, like this is going to be good for students to do X, and then they'll come in and we'll say they did, and it's great. But, you know, getting down to the core of why students want to do the things they're doing, why they want to pursue the educational discipline they're in, why they want to potentially to do well in the course, that's what a lot of this gets at to me. It's the intrinsic parts that are so hard to trigger. And because intrinsic parts are hard to get at, we as an institution tend to focus on the extrinsic motivations and structures, and that rightfully so in many ways. And I think Kurt Hahn had a quote that I won't recall exactly, but he said there are 3 ways to work with students, that essentially you can kind of tell them what to do, or you can try to attract them to it, or you can make them feel needed. And he said that making them feel needed is the one mode that no students have ever refused, essentially. And I think that is just such a powerful thought about what we're trying to do with students, or with our care and concern around students in the classrooms. How do we make them feel needed in this obviously artificial context of the classroom quite often? So we grow beyond it and we reach outside of it and we work within it to do that. I think that's powerful stuff. Getting at the heart of why many of us get into teaching to begin with.
That's great. I want to go back to the mindfulness just for a moment, and just say that, like, mindfulness or stillness can exist when your eyes are closed in a field. They can exist when you can somehow tune out the traffic because you're standing somewhere and you can focus. But in my work, to me, there is stillness in this class, in this homepage. All the empty spots are stillness to me. And I think a lot of what I see in courses is just tons of stuff. It's like a freight train of information going by, whether it's the syllabus that's 8 pages long or whatever it is. It's just all this information and there's no room to breathe in it. And so I've just the value of, as a kind of wannabe graphic artist, I love white space. And I think it is some of that. We're in just such a digital overload time, you know, and maybe that's a space where creating that intentionally in digital environments somehow is one thing that we can aspire to, or whatever.
Pedagogical white space.
I know, right? Another thing, I think that part of the evolution of a teacher might be the increasing ability to recognize that everybody is learning a lot more than what they think is just happening in the room, right? There is a lot of amazing things happening in any classroom anywhere, and really recognizing that and saying, wow, that's really not exactly the behavior or kind of things that we're after here in this class, and being willing to shift gears and do something different, innovative, whatever you want to call it, something different. That takes risk, and that is the potential failure. And as educators, I think that is, we all could do a little more of that risk taking in all kinds of spaces. And I think that's...
And yet realizing we work within institutions that create incentives that don't necessarily support that, and may even actively unintentionally punish that kind of behavior, right? I mean, that's one of the real challenges within different institutions and how they work. The white space thing just reminded me too, we're going to talk about in another entry in this kind of little series, Neil Postman, author of Amusing Ourselves to Death. But I think the idea of the environment we live in right now, informationally, it's both information rich, dense, and intrusive. And how do we find that white space within that for thinking, for existing without the always on with social media platforms, things like that, right? I mean, there's a whole that's very much connected to that idea of presence, awareness, and insight. That is a skill that I feel like students would most benefit from learning as well. You know, I often speak, I'm often asked to talk with groups of students, like say a group of master's students, new master's students, around, you know, learning and technology. And yet the thing that I feel like most of them need most are understanding how to deal with this barrage and manage this in a way that they can have space for learning, that they can have quiet time for reflection, how to take notes in a way that's synthetic, not just, you know, highlighting in a textbook something that contributes to learning, metacognition and awareness, like these skills that they're just not getting. And even at master's and PhD levels, they're not getting that. And I struggle with it, right? I mean, how do you deal with all of this sensory overload and this multiplicity of information? And now we're going to have AI adding to the disinformation sphere and the, you know, maudlin / mediocre information sphere. I don't know how to do that, but I feel like that's where that white space and room is pretty important, and we're not getting it. We're getting it less and less.
I have an example. I'll show you.
Great.
This is my work email. I get hundreds of emails every day. I have 2 emails in my inbox. The rest is white space. That's like really taking out the stuff I don't need and focusing only on the things that I absolutely have to do and need. And I get like 100, more than 100 emails a day. Like, and I very intentionally create that space in my vision, like my stupid computer screen, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big believer in the Pomodoro technique of work, where you set aside 25 minutes just with absolutely no other, and that's just 25 minutes, right? And the idea is to get you into that idea of flow over time, setting aside, figuring out productive routines. And we have an explosive growth in ADHD diagnoses. And where does that come from in terms of the context and how it's supporting or not? I think a lot of that is not new. It's just that we're seeing it more. It's made more visible because of a lot of what's happening around us technologically and in the information space that's surrounding our students in the classroom, you know, in and out of the classroom, as many faculty will attest to, who have asked, how can I stop all my students from using these devices in the class while I'm teaching? And it's like, well, that's not going to be an approach that's going to work, but maybe there's some ways we can help their students understand why they might not want to, which is the same with AI, right? The real challenge is making students understand why it's really not in their best interest to use it in places where their instructors are asking them not to. Yeah, very rich spheres. I want to be cognizant of time. We are supposed to be ending by 1:30. We've obviously only glanced at a surface level at a few of the kind of laws and of both the Salem's laws. I should put quotes around AI all the time as well, AI and laws here in this conversation, as well as expeditionary learning. But I hope that it's just stimulated a little bit of thinking and how you might be able to bring these into the classroom. I certainly here at UW-Tacoma, I'm always a resource to help think through how you might be able to bring this into your classrooms, how I can support that. You come up with the pedagogical ideas and we figure out the implementation. I'm always here for that because that's the most fascinating kind of work. And more importantly, I feel like it's just valuable. The reason I love the idea of this series when Todd said, hey, let's talk about this person. And then I thought, let's do a series, is because so much that like Kurt Hahn did has just not been thought about directly in many years. We see the reflection of the reflection, but going back to the source and thinking about it and how it relates to our context, to me, that's just a rich way. It's like striking the flints to the stone. That's where the sparks come from. And so I hope that this series helps illuminate a little of this and bring them up just so you can follow up. If you're seeing this video somewhere, you're probably seeing it in the context where there will be some documentation, some help, some links. Everything we've talked about will be in a context. So it's not just my talking head to Todd and then all of our heads in boxes. There will also be other materials there to help bring the discussion forward. So I would like to let the last few minutes be here for if you have any final thoughts or comments or suggestions for people who might be watching this who are thinking now about experiential learning and Kurt Hahn, words of wisdom, words of terror. Man, I was hoping one of you would drop something really great and compelling because I don't have a great capper here. I do want to thank you for your time attending here. I think we were supposed to have more that may have had connection issues because I was having some issues myself getting into this session, but we will provide the video and materials. And thank you, Todd, for being the willing participant / victim of this first in the series of discussions. And we will be doing more. We're going to have Neil Postman. The next one is Carl Rogers, which I think is happening on November. Yeah, Carl Rogers. Yep, you brought him up once. See, they're all connected. Everything's connected. I can't remember the date. It will be on your UW calendars and in your emails. I'm sorry, I don't have the date near to hand. I appreciate it. Thanks a lot for your time.
Yep. Thanks.
Talk to you later.
Thank you all very
Thank
much.
you, gentlemen. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye.